If you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place. There is a specific kind of dread that is reserved for the sound of a landline ringing in the middle of the night. For those of us who grew up before the era of smartphones silenced our world, that sound was a harbinger. It usually meant bad news, a relative in the hospital, an accident on a rain-slicked highway, or a family emergency that couldn't wait until dawn. But what happens when you pick up that receiver, bracing yourself for a shaking voice on the other end, and all you find is nothing? I want to tell you about a man named Arthur, a retired insurance adjuster living in a quiet, tree-lined suburb of Ohio. Arthur was a man of routine. He liked his house quiet, his coffee black, and his sleep uninterrupted. But in the autumn of 2014, his routine was shattered by a phone call that arrived at exactly 3:14 a.m. At first, Arthur thought he was dreaming. The ring was sharp, mechanical, the kind of piercing chime that older phones have, the ones that seem to vibrate through the floorboards. He stumbled out of bed, his heart pounding against his ribs, thinking of his sister in Florida or his son out west. He reached the kitchen, grabbed the handset, and pressed it to his ear with a trembling hand. "Hello?" he barked, his voice thick with sleep and adrenaline. There was no reply. No sobbing relative. No frantic explanation. There was only the sound of static, not the digital silence of a dropped cell call, but a deep, rhythmic hiss. It sounded like a heavy wind blowing through an open window, or perhaps, like someone breathing very, very slowly into a receiver miles and miles away. Arthur stood there in the dark for a long minute, the cold linoleum floor chilling his bare feet. "Is someone there?" he asked again, his annoyance beginning to mask his fear. Still, nothing. He hung up, chalking it up to a prank or a glitch in the aging copper wires of the neighborhood. But as he walked back to his bedroom, the house felt different. It felt as though the phone call hadn't ended when he hung up. It felt like a door had been opened, and the air in his hallway had turned thin and cold. What Arthur didn't know then, what none of us realize until it's too late, is that some phone calls aren't meant to transmit information. They are meant to establish a connection. In the days before fiber optics, there was a theory among telephone technicians, a phantom circuit. Sometimes, a call could bypass the switchboards, originating from a place that doesn't exist on any map. The next night, at exactly 3:14 a.m., the phone rang again. This time, Arthur didn't rush. He lay in the dark, watching the red numbers of his alarm clock. 3:14. The chime was louder this time, more insistent. It felt like the house was screaming. He didn't answer it. He let it ring 20 times before it finally stopped. But the moment the silence returned, he heard something that made his blood turn to ice. Through the thin walls of his old house, he heard his neighbor's phone start to ring. Then the house across the street. A wave of mechanical chimes was moving down his block, one house at a time, like a predator checking every door in the dark. Arthur sat up in bed, his eyes wide in the darkness. He realized then that whatever was calling wasn't looking for a person. It was looking for an entry point. And by answering that first call, he had already invited the static inside. By the third night, the dread had moved from Arthur's mind into his physical body. You know that feeling, the way your stomach tightens when you know something inevitable is coming. He had tried to be proactive. He called the phone company, but the technician on the other end was dismissive. "Old lines, Mr. Henderson," the man had said with a tired sigh. "Probably just some moisture in the junction box or a short in the neighborhood grid. We'll send someone out Tuesday." But Tuesday was a lifetime away when it was 3 a.m. on a Sunday morning. Arthur sat at his kitchen table, a single dim light over the stove casting long, distorted shadows across the room. He had the phone sitting right in front of him. He had decided he wasn't going to let it haunt him from a distance. If it rang, he would face it. He watched the digital clock on the microwave. The seconds ticked by with agonizing slowness. 3:12. 3:13. And then, precisely as the clock hit 3:14, the kitchen was pierced by that sharp, mechanical chime. This time, Arthur didn't hesitate. He snatched the receiver off the hook before the first ring could even finish. He didn't say hello. He didn't speak at all. He just listened. The static was there, just like before, but it had evolved. It was no longer a flat, white hiss. It was layered. There was a low-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate in Arthur's jawbone, and beneath that, a sound like dry leaves being dragged over a gravel road. And then, there was the breathing. It wasn't the heavy panting of a prankster. It was a wet, rhythmic rattling, the sound of someone struggling to breathe through a throat filled with fluid. Arthur gripped the handset so hard his knuckles turned white. "Who is this?" he whispered. "I have caller ID. I'll call the police." He lied, of course. His caller ID screen was blank, not unknown, not private, just empty. As if the phone didn't even recognize that a signal was coming through the wire. Then, through the static, a voice began to bleed through. It was faint, barely more than a ripple in the white noise. It was a woman's voice, but it sounded distorted, as if it were being transmitted from the bottom of a very deep well. She wasn't speaking to him, she was reciting something. 42. 17. 89. She whispered, her voice cracking with a strange, melodic sorrow. "The water is so cold, Arthur. Why didn't you look at the water?" Arthur's heart stopped. He hadn't told anyone his name. And more importantly, he hadn't thought about the water in 30 years. Not since the summer of 1984, when he had been a young man working as a claims adjuster at the reservoir. There had been an accident, a car that had veered off the road and vanished into the dark, silt-heavy depths. He had been the one to sign off on the paperwork. He had been the one to decide it wasn't worth the cost of a full recovery dive because the currents were too dangerous. "Who are you?" he gasped, his voice breaking. The voice on the other end didn't answer. Instead, the static surged. It became a roar, a deafening wall of sound that felt like it was trying to burst his eardrums. And in that roar, he heard the sound of a car horn, long, distorted, and echoing, followed by the sound of glass shattering. Arthur slammed the phone back onto the base, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He stood in the silent kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound left. But the silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt crowded. He looked at the phone, and his eyes widened. Even though the receiver was firmly on the hook, the red and used light on the base was still glowing. He lunged for the cord and ripped it out of the wall jack with a violent jerk. The light stayed on. He grabbed the phone and threw it across the room, watching it shatter against the cabinet. The light stayed on, glowing a deep, sickly crimson in the darkness of the kitchen. That was when he realized the connection wasn't through the wires. The wires were just the excuse. The connection was now inside the house, and whatever had been at the bottom of that reservoir for 30 years had finally found a way to call him back. The next morning didn't bring the relief of daylight. For Arthur, the sun rising over the Ohio suburbs felt thin and artificial, like a lamp struggling to illuminate a room filled with thick, invisible smoke. He had spent the remaining hours of the night sitting in his armchair with a flashlight, watching the shattered remains of the telephone on his kitchen floor. The red light had finally faded just before dawn, but the silence that followed was even worse. It was a watchful silence. When you reach a certain age, that bracket between 60 and 70, you start to doubt your own senses. You blame your heart, your blood pressure, or a trick of the light. Arthur tried to tell himself that the voice on the phone was a hallucination brought on by sleep apnea or the stress of retirement. But then he saw the kitchen floor. In the spot where the phone had landed, there was a small, damp patch on the linoleum. He touched it with his fingertip. It wasn't tap water. It was murky, smelling of silt, decaying vegetation, and old, stagnant iron. He spent the day trying to stay busy. He went to the grocery store, he spoke to his neighbor about the weather, he tried to watch the evening news. But every time a phone rang in a television commercial, or every time a stranger's cell phone chimed in the checkout line, Arthur's entire body would lock up. He felt as though he were walking through a minefield, waiting for the ground to give way. By 9 p.m., he had disconnected every electronic device in his house. He pulled the plug on the television, the microwave, even the bedside lamp. He sat in the center of his living room in total darkness, convinced that if he gave the static no medium to travel through, it couldn't reach him. But that is the mistake we all make, thinking that technology is the source of the haunting, rather than just the veil it hides behind. As 3:14 a.m. approached, the air in the house began to vibrate. It wasn't a sound at first, but a pressure in his sinuses, the kind you feel before a massive thunderstorm. Arthur closed his eyes tight, clutching his knees to his chest. "I won't listen. I won't hear it." Suddenly, his own voice began to play back to him. Not from a speaker, but from the very air around his head. 42. 17. 89. It was the recording of his own voice from 30 years ago. He recognized the tone, the younger, more arrogant version of himself. He was hearing the internal dictation he'd recorded into his handheld device at the scene of the reservoir accident in 1984. Recovery dive deemed non-viable, his younger self whispered into the dark room. Cost-benefit analysis suggests the currents are too high. Vehicle recovery cancelled. Case closed. "It wasn't closed for me, Arthur," a woman's voice replied. This time, it wasn't coming through a phone. It was coming from the hallway. Arthur snapped his flashlight on and swung the beam toward the door. The hallway was empty, but the wallpaper was beginning to peel away in long, wet strips. Water was seeping out from under the baseboards, dark, brackish water that began to pool on the carpet. The smell of the reservoir was now overwhelming, filling his lungs until he felt like he was drowning in open air. He realized then that his psychological fear wasn't a symptom of aging. It was a symptom of a connection that had never truly been severed. In 1984, he had made a choice to save a few $1,000s for an insurance firm by leaving a human being at the bottom of a lake. He had turned a person into a claim number, and in doing so, he had invited that number to wait for him. The static returned, but now it was coming from the walls themselves. The house was acting as a giant receiver. The humming in his teeth grew so intense he thought his molars would shatter. He scrambled toward the front door, desperate to reach the street, to reach the lights of his neighbors' houses. But when he grabbed the brass doorknob, it didn't feel like metal. It was cold, wet, and soft, like a handful of lake weeds. He pulled the door open, but there was no Ohio suburb on the other side. There was only a wall of gray, churning water and the faint, rhythmic sound of a telephone ringing. Somewhere deep below the surface. The sensation of the water didn't last. In a blink, Arthur found himself standing in his own doorway, staring out at his familiar, dark street. The gray waves were gone. The smell of the reservoir had retreated to a faint, metallic tang in the air. But the silence that followed wasn't a relief, it was the silence of a trap that had finally snapped shut. He stumbled back into his living room, his legs shaking. He checked his watch. 3:20 a.m. The 6 minutes of the call were over. He collapsed onto his sofa, burying his face in his hands, gasping for air that still felt far too heavy. He told himself he had survived. He told himself that whatever debt was owed had surely been paid through the sheer terror of the night. But as his breathing slowed, he noticed something on his coffee table. There, sitting in the middle of the mahogany surface, was his old handheld recorder, the one he had used in the 80s, the one he had thrown away in a dumpster behind the insurance office the day he retired. It was dry. It looked brand new. With a trembling hand, Arthur reached out and pressed the play button. There was a long stretch of silence, followed by the familiar hiss of magnetic tape. Then, his own voice from 1984 began to speak, but the words were different. The recording had changed. "I can see her now," the younger Arthur said on the tape, his voice calm and clinical. "She's looking up through the windshield. The water is filling the cabin, but she isn't screaming. She's reaching for her phone. She's trying to dial a number. My number." Arthur's heart hammered. He had never recorded those words. He didn't even know she'd had a phone in the car. The tape continued. "I'm going to let the line stay open," his younger self whispered. "I'm going to let the static bridge the gap between her world and mine. That way, when the time comes, she'll know exactly where to find me." The recording ended with a sharp, electronic click. At that exact moment, every light in the house flickered to life, not with their usual warm glow, but with a harsh, flickering blue light. And then, the sound returned. It wasn't a phone ring this time. It was the sound of a woman's voice coming through the air vents, the light fixtures, and the cracks in the floorboards. She was no longer whispering numbers. She was laughing, a soft, bubbling sound that sounded like water escaping a submerged pipe. Arthur realized then that the midnight caller wasn't a ghost trying to haunt him. It was a beacon. By answering those calls, by engaging with the static, he hadn't just remembered the accident. Dia telememberikan izin bagi frekuensi itu untuk menempati ruang fiknya. He looked down at his own hands. They were wet. Not with water, but with a dark, oily substance that smelled of the deep reservoir. He tried to wipe it off on his trousers, but it wouldn't come away. It was seeping out from under his own fingernails. The blue lights in the house began to pulse in time with a rhythmic thumping sound coming from the kitchen. Thump. 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 The sound of someone walking with heavy, waterlogged shoes. Arthur didn't run. He couldn't. He sat in his chair, watching as the shadows in the hallway began to move, stretching toward him like long, dark fingers. He realized the final truth of the silent caller: the call only ends when both sides of the line are in the same room. As the figure emerged from the darkness of the hallway, draped in weeds, her face a blurred reflection of the one he had seen in the truck window, Arthur felt a strange, cold peace. He reached out his hand. The last thing recorded on his handheld device that night wasn't a voice. It was the sound of a telephone being picked up, followed by a long, clear dial tone. And then, the sound of a line being cut forever. When the police checked the house 3 days later, they found the doors locked from the inside. The house was bone dry, except for a single shattered telephone on the kitchen floor. There was no sign of Arthur. But when the lead detective picked up the receiver of the broken phone, just out of curiosity, he didn't hear a dial tone. He heard the sound of a car horn, distant and muffled, and a man's voice whispering a set of coordinates that led straight to the center of the old reservoir.